Rabbi Stephen Wernick, welcome to the Honest Report podcast.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So I want to talk about your recent column in the Globe and Mail on June 2nd. Broadly speaking, without getting into really the meat and potatoes, you were talking about Prime Minister Mark Carney's address at a Toronto synagogue about anti-Semitism. But I wanted to ask, what do you make of the significance, A, of the address in general, B, of the location, the timing? Some critics have said, he should have made it in Parliament, he should have been somewhere else, he should have done it sooner. Curious for your thoughts on that.
I think that anytime the leader of a country, the Prime Minister, speaks and gives a significant address, it really doesn't matter where it is. I mean, not to me. This was designed to be a message for all of Canada. The press was specifically invited for that purpose. And the Prime Minister is on record with his remarks to the Jewish community, to Canada, about using his words, the scourge of anti-Semitism, as a deliberate and brutal attack against the Jews of Canada. And so I think that from that perspective, the location is less important than what was said. And what was said was significant. The Prime Minister was unequivocal about his condemnation about anti-Semitism. I think he was very sincere. I think the morality that he expressed was the right tone and message the Jewish community needed to hear. I wish it was something that would have been heard earlier, including in Prime Minister Trudeau's administration. But this is a very long journey that we're on as Jews. On October 7th, when the massacres happened, it was Shmini Atzeret here in the diaspora, and it was Yizkor, the prayers for the memorial service of all the departed in our communities. And I remember putting aside my prepared Yizkor remarks and speaking from the heart to the congregation. And one of the things that I understood at that time instinctively, having watched the anti-Semitic responses to the 2014 Gaza operations between Israel and Hamas, was that anti-Semitism was going to blow up out of proportion, and that it was going to take many, many years for us to have to fight it, and before our societies would kind of find their new equilibrium and marginalize anti-Semitism again. So I wish that this speech would have happened sooner, but I think it's important that it happened. And I'm glad that the Prime Minister took it as seriously as he did. In terms of expectations, I don't think, as I wrote in my Globe and Mail article, or Globe and Mail op-ed, I don't think the Prime Minister went far enough.
Now, in your column, you said that there were two elephants in the room, as you called them. First things first, first is Israel, and second is the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. Let's talk about Israel. He only said it briefly in French, but basically that there was, in your argument, that there was a bifurcation between anti-Semitism and what's happening in Israel. Now, of course, you know as well as anybody that when there's a war in Israel, of course, that happens here in Canada as well, the anti-Semitism. But good faith critics would say, well, hold on a minute here. I'm being asked not to criticize Israel. And Mark Carney, of course, is a very strident, hardline, even critic of Israel. And they would say, why shouldn't I be able to criticize Israel? Of course, you know that's not the case. But help them understand why criticism of Israel is acceptable, but where it goes over the line and when that becomes anti-Semitism.
So I want to bring that question broader. It's not just Prime Minister Carney. I think that there's a general misunderstanding in society about the difference between legitimate criticism of a government and the actions that it takes, and illegitimate criticism of a government and the actions that it takes. For whatever reasons, Israel is the only country that is fighting a war for whom the fighting of that war raises questions of its legitimacy and its right to exist. That's the IRA definition, the fine line that gets drawn between what is anti-Semitism and what is legitimate criticism. I think that there's a general disbelief of and misunderstanding in most of Western society of that distinction between what's legitimate and so forth. I would never say that the prime minister or anyone shouldn't criticize Israel. I think Israel should be criticized just in the same way I criticized the Prime Minister of Canada for elements of this speech that I thought were missing from both a moral perspective and, quite frankly, from a policy perspective. So it's not about not criticizing Israel. Go right ahead. There's nobody more critical of Israeli government policies than Israelis themselves. The question becomes understanding the distinction. And one of the things that really concerns me in our day and age is that information, much of it misinformation and disinformation, is coming at us from multiple sources and people that purport to be legitimate journalists and critics and so forth. And and there's no pause to evaluate the source of that criticism. For example, Israel arrested and detained and stopped these people that were coming on the flotilla with the purported aim of bringing humanitarian aid and ending Israel's blockade of Gaza. These people were arrested and they were brought to Israel and detained there. There's no doubt that Minister Ben-Gvir and his remarks were inappropriate, immoral, and that some of the actions that we witnessed were just not okay. That is deserving of criticism. What concerns me, though, is that those same people, when they arrived in Turkey and then were transferred to Canadian authorities, for example, suddenly there's all these charges of very serious misconduct and mistreatment that doesn't seem to match their ability to walk out of the airports into the airports. Then suddenly they're in strollers, and then they're not in strollers or wheelchairs and so forth. And they're making these very, very serious charges, and without any kind of investigation, suddenly everybody's getting on the bandwagon and criticizing Israel for this horrific treatment. And so that's illegitimate in my mind in that moment without any investigation or understanding what actually occurred. And so it's not that Israel shouldn't be criticized. It's just that the default position is that Israel is evil. And when that happens, when you have that, what, as I wrote about, Sharansky's 3Ds, the first being demonization, when Israel is demonized and is the epitome of evil in the world, and everyone's default position is that that is actually what's going on, that's where it becomes illegitimate. And so I would like to see the prime minister show a little bit more intelligence and nuance in the distinctions between demonizing Israel and legitimately criticizing Israel.
Now, a lot of critics have critiqued the speech for what was absent, namely the description and depiction of anti-Semitism as this kind of mysterious plague, as opposed to something that is manifesting primarily through two arenas. One is radical Islam, and the other is the far left. How important is it that those be mentioned, and how critical is it that Mark Carney did not mention those?
Yeah, so I think that the absence of a serious mention of radical Islam as one of the elements driving anti-Semitism today is related to the prime minister's decision to disconnect foreign policy issues from anti-Semitism. And I think that this is a common error and naivete of Western leaders, where they want to see anti-Semitism as similar in nature to any other hatred that exists in the world. And there just seems to be a refusal to understand that it's not the same, and that anti-Semitism, as the oldest hatred in the world, has been masterfully morphed again, where Israel becomes the international Jew. And so the criticisms of Israel take on the form of all the tropes of anti-Semitism in the past. And I think political leaders are worried both from calling that out specifically of angering the Muslim population and getting pushback from them. But I think they just don't understand the connection, and they refuse. Western leaders tend to refuse that such a thing is possible. They don't believe that they don't want to believe that there's a hatred in the world that leads to a desire to exterminate a people. And they view hatred as something that is not bad, but still marginal in terms of its behavior. But that's not necessarily the case with anti-Semitism. And I think that the the bifurcation, that distinction, is representative of a deeper misunderstanding and poor judgment from political leaders in terms of how to address anti-Semitism, which is why I said in my Globe and Mail op-ed that ultimately, without addressing the connection between Israel and foreign policy and anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, the end result is going to be the undermining of what I think the Prime Minister sincerely wanted to accomplish.
Now, how can the Jewish community and its allies do a better job in terms of articulating some of the things you've talked about, in terms of drawing attention to radical Islam, drawing attention to the far left? If not, how can they do a better job of that in the future?
So I agree with that. I think most people don't understand the nuances of these conversations. And I think even the Jewish community is afraid of legitimately criticizing Israel because we feel that we're going to give fuel to our enemies, and they're just going to take it, misunderstand it, and use it for their own marketing and promotional materials. And I think there's a lot of truth with that, quite frankly, that our enemies are going to do that. But as a religious leader, my concern isn't with what our enemies do with our moral positions. My concern is, what are our moral positions? And I think that we're living in a moment where it's really complicated. And I think we have done ourselves a disservice as a people by not speaking forcefully, morally, on the very complex issues that we have. So, for example, I think we've done ourselves a disservice by not expressing enough empathy for the devastation that the Palestinians and the Lebanese have experienced as a result of these wars. Now, showing empathy for the devastation that they have experienced is not admitting guilt or responsibility for the causes of our response. There is no doubt that Hamas's brutal attack on October 7th, Hezbollah joining in, and its continuous rocket fire into the north create justifiable cause for Israel's reaction to defend itself, not only to defend itself, to stop the rocket firing attacks, but also because this has been an ongoing cycle for decades with these groups. And the level of these attacks were so brutal and horrifying that Israel has an obligation to defend its citizens by ensuring that its enemies cannot mount these kinds of attacks again. And what we've seen is the end result of that. And the two they're not mutually exclusive. I think at the same time, when Israel's leaders speak some of the words that we've heard them say, which are unprofessional from people that are prosecuting a war and leading a country that's under siege, we have to call that out, and we have to hold our own leaders accountable for that. And it doesn't matter to me what our enemies are going to do with it, because they're going to do what they're going to do with it anyway. I'm more concerned about our own neshamot, our own souls, and I think that requires a very sober approach to the complex issues that we're having today. I think that we in the diaspora, especially in Canada, we've been very comfortable in this country for the last 60 years, 70 years. And what we're discovering is that anti-Semitism, even here, has been underneath the surface, and it still exists. And we were caught off guard. And when you're caught off guard and you're feeling attacked, your instinct is to lash out, which is, I think, what we've done. And what we're seeing now, that 2.5, 3 years, almost 3 years have passed, is we're beginning to understand more deeply the nature of the threat that we're facing. And we're beginning to respond, I think, in a more nuanced way. I think that one of the reasons why the Prime Minister responded at this moment, to get back to your first question, is because the Jewish community successfully lobbied the Prime Minister that he needs to speak up, and that anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem to fix. It's a Canadian problem to fix. And what I'm pleased about is that he clearly heard that message and got on national TV and before a Jewish audience and said exactly that, which is what we've been asking him to do. So I'm really thankful that we've accomplished Ad Khan to this point. But as I wrote in my article, as we're talking about, and as others that are observing this are writing about as well, he hasn't yet gone far enough to really address this issue. And I think we need to keep lobbying and creating allies wherever we can in order to keep pushing the country in that direction.
Rabbi Stephen Wernick, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.